Je vous souhaite le bienvenue au Metropolis Bleu 2021. Welcome to Blue Metropolis 2021. My name is Shelley Pomerantz. I'd like to begin by acknowledging that we are broadcasting from Tiohtià:ke, which is what the Kanien'kehá:ka call Montreal. This place has and continues to be a historical gathering place for many Indigenous peoples, and we're grateful to be part of a long and proud history of creating and sharing stories on these lands. Welcome to this event featuring acclaimed Israeli author and activist David Grossman in conversation with historian and author Derek Penslar. This event is part of the spring program of the 2021 Blue Metropolis International Literary Festival. David Grossman was born in Jerusalem. He's the author of numerous works of fiction, nonfiction, and children's literature. His writing has appeared in The New Yorker and been translated into more than 40 languages. He's the recipient of many prizes, including France's Chevalier de l'Ordre des Arts et des Lettres, the Buxtehude Böhle in Germany, Israel's Emet Prize, the Man Booker International Prize, and the Albatross Prize given by the Günter Grass Foundation. He lives in Jerusalem. Derek Penslar is the William Lee Frost Professor of Jewish History at Harvard University and the Samuel Zaks Professor of Jewish History Emeritus at the University of Toronto. His most recent book, Theodor Herzl, The Charismatic Leader, won the 2020 Canadian Jewish Literary Award for History. Before we go any further, I would like to mention that books by David Grossman and Derek Penslar are available through paragraphbooks.com. That's for books in English, and for books in French, leslibraires.ca. David Grossman's novels are masterpieces of literary imagination and uncanny verisimilitude. Today, he and Derek Penslar will talk about the man behind the novels, the themes that run through the tapestry of his writing, and the connection between his fiction and his journalism about Israel and the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. I welcome you both.
Hi, Shelley.
Thank you very much for inviting me, and thank you, David, for the opportunity to speak with you. It's a pleasure and an honor. I'd like to start by asking you something about your latest novel, which came out in Israel about a year and a half ago, but it's available in many languages worldwide, and it will be coming out, including French. It's already available in French, but it will be coming out in English in just a few months. And in some ways, it has themes that are similar to your previous work, but in some ways it's quite different in terms of its environment. I mean, where it's actually placed and the relationship between history and your own imagination. Can you tell us a little bit about the book and how you came to write it?
It was brought to me by a lady called Eva Panic-Nahir, who was born to a Jewish family in Croatia, in the city of Čakovec. And later she came to Israel. And one day she called me on the phone and she had some remarks regarding an article that I wrote the other day. And I noticed there was something very special about the way she spoke and about her accent. It was a mishmash of Hebrew, of Hungarian, of Croatian. And I started to ask her about herself. And she was very generous and very cooperative. But at a very crucial moment at her life story, she stopped and she said, I don't want to bother you too much with my story. Can I call you back later, in some time? And I said, yes, please do. And I think 2 or 3 days later, she called and she continued the story. And she had this tactic and technique of Harun al-Rashid, of Scheherazade, that she stopped always in the most crucial and important point. And step by step, she gave me all her life story, which was one of the most extreme life stories I've ever heard. And you know that people usually come and give a writer a story, their life story, hoping that he or she will make something out of it. And usually I say, I cannot get stories from the outside. It has to come from myself, from within me. But in this case, there was something so total about the story that she told me, so extreme and touching so many layers of behavior, of identity, that I could not have resisted it. And I said, please tell me more and more and more. And then even one day I came to her home in a kibbutz in the north of Israel, and we sat for 2 days and 2 nights, and she just told me her story from the beginning to the end. And I already knew that I'm going to write it. And she all the time checked with me if I really want to write it. And I said, yes, Eva, her name was Eva Panich Nahir. Yes, I will write your story, but I will not write it as a documentarist. It will not be written exactly as things took place in real life. I'm a fiction writer. I must digest it. I must rewrite it through myself. And she said, of course, you are an artist. And so I did.
And is this, I don't recall now, is this the first novel you have written that is primarily set, or that is largely set outside of Israel?
Yes, there is a chapter in Sea and the Love that takes place in the ocean, but this doesn't count. I write about Israel maybe because it's the only reality that I really understand and can decode, or I think I can decode. And it's my home, it's my place, it's my language. And I will not dare to write about a situation that I know only partly.
And yet when you do in this novel, I don't want to give too much away, but there are sections outside of Israel that are extremely realistic and powerful, and that contribute to something very special to the book. One thing about the book, you've mentioned this power of this woman, Eva, whom you knew and who's the basis for the main character in the book. There's, your books tend to have small casts, and this one has four characters. I think Horse Walks into a Bar really has 2 characters, one of your previous novels, and To the End of the Land is primarily about 3 people. So, and at least in 2 of these novels, at least one of the major characters is a woman. And in your newest novel, 3 of the 4 characters, and actually the 3 most important characters, are all women. And this is something that's fascinating because male authors have sometimes been taken to task for not depicting women in 3 dimensions or for problems in their depiction of women. There's now a new biography of Philip Roth, and much of the controversy about Roth has to do with his relations with women, but also the way he depicts women in his fiction. Similar things were said about the late John Updike. And yet in your fiction, you don't just write about women, they're central to the work. And I'm wondering how you approach that, and if that again has been a self-conscious strategy, and how you've dealt with writing through a woman's voice.
Well, first, it's more interesting and challenging for me to write a woman because I know how to write a man, and it's not that kind of a challenge for me. But to describe a woman with all the dimensions, or the dimensions that I'm able to understand, is intriguing. I remember when I was writing To the End of the Land, where the main character is a woman, Ora, 50 years old, Israeli, quite typical woman and very, very unique in her way. And I tried to understand her, and I was unable to understand her. I wanted to really to know her, almost in the biblical meaning of the term, really to know her, to prevail in all her body and her soul. And I was unable to do it. There were many words around her, but none of the words really, or the sentences, really gave me the feeling that I totally understand and know this woman. And I felt that I'm losing this novel after 2.5 years of writing it. I felt that I cannot conclude it if I do not know Ora as I should know my character. And then out of despair, I did something very natural, I think. I wrote her a letter, not a mail even, an email, but I just took a pen and a page and an envelope, and I started, "Dear Ora, why are you like that? Why are you so stubborn? Why don't you surrender to me?" And I tell you, Derek, the moment I wrote, "Why don't you surrender to me?" it pierced me. What a stupid I was, because it's not Ora who has to surrender to me. It is me who have to surrender to Ora, who have to stop being so entrenched in front of her, but allow her to prevail in me, to invade me and to prevail in me. And the moment I formulated it to myself in these words, suddenly it was very clear. I just have not to interfere, just have to allow this woman be me. And me she was. And suddenly it was the story, I just had to follow it when I was writing about her. And in other scales, it was the same thing with the three women of More Than I Love My Life. That's the English title of this book. But you know, after a while that you write every other, it doesn't really matter that she's a woman or that this character is an old Palestinian storyteller or this one is a commander of an extermination camp. It is an other. And it's, I mean, the heart of the matter is not to impose on this other my inner constitution, but to allow his constitution or her constitution to surface and just to document it.
This is fascinating, and I think for someone who isn't an artist, it's hard to understand how an author who creates characters is in some ways not creating the characters. You're talking about a feeling where you write a letter to your own fictional character to try to understand her, and that you say you need to surrender to her. One of the great pleasures, at least for an old-fashioned, 19th century novel, is a very fine etching of a character. And one feels that the author has intentionally, endowed this character with all sorts of qualities. And by the end of the novel, you have come to really know this person. So I'm thinking of my favorite author is George Eliot, for example. So by the end of Middlemarch, you know Dorothea better than you know anyone on the planet. Or by the end of Daniel Deronda, you know Gwendolyn Harleth better than anyone. And the joke, but maybe it's a misplaced joke, after I finished reading your novel To the End of the Land some years ago, I told my students that I felt that I now knew Aura better than anyone, including my wife, who I've now known for almost 40 years. But it's fascinating to me that in a way, though, you were not fully in charge, as it were, of her creation. And that you felt that something was coming into you from her, even though she's not real. So this is just a fascinating process. Maybe you can talk a bit more about it.
First of all, thank you for what you said. Maybe the secret is that a literary character has this quality that you do not have to describe him totally, but you have to describe him or her deeply enough so it will radiate other things and will allow you to project on this radiation your own values or perceptions or points of view. It's a very delicate tango between the writer and the book. It's a very strange couplehood between the two. That, yes, I want her to be very tangible. I want her to be concrete. I want her to be someone that all the time is on the verge of existing in real life. And yet I have to stop her at a certain point so it will leave place to this radiation, this non-verbal radiation. And I think this is why, it's so often that people approach me or write to me about characters, and they continue to describe the character, and it's not as I meant it to be. But I like the idea that the radiation allows all kind of developments of this character.
So there's a certain occlusion or limitation that, sometimes it's I see it in your plot lines that you deliberately, there's secrets that will eventually be revealed. There are things that are hinted at that eventually come out. And it's like that with people too. We think we know someone in a certain way, and this happens in our real lives. And then later on, we realize we come to know them in a different way than before. And how in your novels, it's like unpeeling. I feel like as I'm reading your novels, we're unpeeling something. But in a way, it sounds like everybody has their own piece of fruit, as it were, and everyone is unpeeling it in their own way, because you're saying that your readers inject their own perceptions, their own selfhood into your characters.
I think that this process happens because mostly in my books, there is someone who is telling a story to another human being. And even if in the beginning the telling of the story is rigid because the person, he's not telling something new, but he just quotes himself or herself telling this story in the last time they have told it. But I think I try to get to the point where suddenly the story changes and the storyteller changes and the listener changes. Because you know that every one of us, we have our legislative stories. Yes, the basic story of our life, of our biography. Usually it has to do with our childhood and how we were misunderstood by our parents, by our siblings, by our friends, and how lonely we were and how insulted we were all the time. I'm smiling, but I'm not joking. It can be really tragic. But it's not that tragic if you repeat it again and again and again. And at a certain point, maybe you do not realize anymore that you're not telling your own intimate and really authentic story, but you're just, as I said, quoting yourself. But if you tell the story in a different way, and if you have a good person who listens to you, an active listener, who is able to extricate the story from you, to take it out of you, then suddenly the old story starts to melt. You know, the act of telling the story is like massaging the story. We are massagists in part of our job. And if you massage the story rightly, suddenly it becomes to life again. And it is told in a way that, hey, you look at this reality that you described hundreds of times, but maybe we misunderstood something. Maybe we were blind to some development, to some needs or the interest of the listener who listened to us. Maybe we understand that also Mama had a Mama, and that justified the horrible things she have done to us. Also, Father had a father of himself, and he was trapped also in his legislative story. And I remember very vividly in my life, when suddenly such a story started to decongeal, to melt. And suddenly there was movement in a place that was before it was like a stiff muscle of my mind, of my consciousness. And there was a flow of things. And I was able to really to feel with much more empathy people that I didn't like or that I was vengeful regarding them. But I'm talking here about individuals and the way the change of the legislative story, how it can revitalize them and bring new air into their life. But it applies also to countries and to nations. Because every nation, when it starts, it needs a kind of a mythological story, this legislative story. And of course, it's very essential in the beginning, in the creation of a nation. We all must know how good and rightful we were and how horrible and evil and devilish our enemy was. But maybe after some decades, it's useful to check on our legislative myths and to see, are they still relevant? Are they still actual? Or maybe they stick us, maybe they imprison us, maybe we become prisoners of our legislative stories. And okay. Yeah.
Well, it's the international relations scholars call it cognitive routines, that states, like individuals, get into cognitive routines that can be self-assuring, even if they're actually physically dangerous. That it might be bad for your health to constantly go through life paranoid and think, and insecure, but it also, you know exactly what you are because you believe that everybody hates you, for example. And there are people who apply this to countries that are, in conflict all the time. But in your stories, when the legislative narrative, as you've referred to it, changes, it's the result of contacts with, again, very small clusters of people. Because you write about, I guess all novelists write about families, but there's something quite special about the way you write about families. These very intimate relations, again, small casts, small circles of people, lovers, parents and children. And the kind of love you write about it's quite intense. There's an intensity that characterizes your novels, which can be uncomfortable sometimes, the kind of love that you write about. And I'm wondering about, again, if this is intentional to write about a kind of love. It's not just simply a dysfunctional family or a happy family, but you seem to be writing much more about the connective tissue, the kind of love, than just the stories of the characters themselves. And that's something at least I carry away from your books, is what I see as a very special way of thinking about the meaning of love.
Yes, it's a question. Why the love relationship or any relationship in my books are so extreme? Well, maybe it appeals to me. Maybe I think that through the relationship of human beings, we can touch really the deepest layers of everything. I like to think that behind or under every human story, there is another human story and another human story. It's like the human archaeology is the archaeology of the stories that we tell ourselves, that people tell us about ourselves. And I always felt I was a child that was very interested in stories of the elderly people in the family. You know, in every family, there is one of every generation, one child who is really curious about their life and the questions of the grown-ups. And I think I understood from a very young age the power of the family story, the fact that it's a very small group of people and they are made of the materials, sometimes of the actual concrete materials of two other members of this family, a man and a woman. And everything that happens in this family echoes so many layers and sends us to different directions and different interpretation of the situation. And I like to think that the most dramatic events in human history, they have not occurred in corridors of parliament or in palaces, on battlefields, but in kitchens and in children's rooms and in bedrooms. There was something that is so deep that maybe suddenly you just feel yourself only a vehicle of some coded information from the past to the future, and maybe you yourself cannot decode it, but at least you deliver it.
This is why I and a number of my colleagues who are professors in the humanities and social sciences encourage our students to read literature, because we tend to write about aggregates. We write about social forces and aggregates. And what's ironic is that in the humanities, human beings are often lost. And the quantum element gets lost. And of course, in your work, it is on a very intimate level. And this even shows up in the titles of some of your earlier books, the Book of Intimate Grammar, See Under Love. So these things are very powerful. Then that leads to the question of how much of yourself goes into these books, how much is simply, again, an artistic craft, because there are bits of you in all of your books. Sometimes it's more prominent than others. There's the personal tragedy you experienced that led to the writing of Falling Out of Time. There are other aspects of your life that, at least in some ways, seem to, I guess, more clearly in from your childhood in See Under Love. Again, how do you make those decisions of how much of yourself is going to go into a book, when you're going to maybe put yourself aside?
It's not a decision. It's a process that happens while writing, where by the writing and rewriting, I start to recognize the heart of the story. And the heart of the story is usually a very intimate, personal thing that I have experienced, or that I am a good candidate for this, even if it didn't happen to me. But the structure of my soul, this idea appeals to it. And I remember very vividly several times in the past when I was writing a story and I did not understand, why do I have to write this story? And I struggled with it. And I said, it's not my story. There are the other writers who should write it. And then, because I felt that the story insists on me and wouldn't let me go and come back to me in conversations with other people, in dreams, in drafts. And then suddenly I realized that not only that I am close to this idea, but it's so relevant. It's such an inward, if one can say so, idea that it formulates me in a way that I've never formulated before. But again, it's not a decision, it's a process, and I love the process. I'm now in the very beginning of such a process. And there is an idea in what I'm writing. I still don't know what it is, but I feel I'm, like I'm peeling layer after layer of cataracts, not only from my poor eyes, but from all my body and all my soul. And I know that if I will insist on this story, if I'll not give up of despair, of not understanding it, of not being able to write it, I will find something that will be meaningful to my life. It will tell me my story, my own story, in a way that I am not protected from. And to be surprised by your own writing, sometimes to be betrayed by your own writing, because the writing takes me to a place that I'm afraid to be, that might be destructive to my relationship with my wife, with my children, with my parents, with my prime minister. But to get there, to be there, it's such a gift, to come to this place and to suddenly to see yourself from another point of view, or to see other people who are close to you from a totally different point of view. I have this strange and very uneconomic system of writing. I write draft after draft after draft, many, many times. To the end of the land, I wrote more than 25 times, but I say wrote, I don't mean cut and paste. The first 8, 9 versions are longhand written. I need the effort, I need the fatigue that comes after writing. And only when there are too many notebooks piling on my table, then I move to the computer, and then it's another phase in the writing. But I remember when I was writing the book of intimate grammar, and I finished version number 12, let's say, and I came exhausted to my wife, and I said, I finished this version at last. It was such an exhausting version. And she gave me one of her looks, and she said, but tomorrow you will start version number 13. And I said, yes, you are right. She's a psychologist. You are right. Why do I do it? I asked. Because it was the first time it came clear to me that there is a machinery here, a mechanism, so to say. And so we did something very strange. We took one paragraph from each one of the versions, and we sellotaped it on the wall. And then we walked and read out loud from number 1 to number 2, 3, until 12. Now, from 1 to 3, there were huge changes. And from 3 to 8, smaller and smaller changes. And then, step by step, you could have seen how this word was thrown out because you don't have to use it because the whole paragraph says it. Or this exclamation mark, it's outrageous. It shouldn't be there in the first place. And then step by step, you got to version number 12. And then I could have felt, and also my wife, that the musicality of the paragraph has almost been completed. And by the way, I said musicality, I think a lot of literature is music. And this is why I always, when I finish the writing of any of my books, I read it out loud because I need to hear the music. And I read once that Flaubert, the genius, great Flaubert, used to stand at his window and to shout out to the sorrow of his neighbors, I guess, the novels that he has written. And he also hosted his best friends, the brothers Goncourt, and he read to them for hours and hours. And I think he did it not only to get their verdict, but also when he read it out loud, he suddenly was able to hear it as the reader would read it in her or his inner ear. And yeah, okay.
No, that's fascinating because, well, first off, because you're describing the difficulty. I mean, it's not easy. When you're describing the writing process is not easy. And it's exhausting. But also then the process of perfection, which is both craftsmanship, but also then, I mean, just frankly, hard work. And it reminds me of, there's a publisher in Cambridge who runs a press called The Other Press, and she's published some Israeli novelists, including, I think, Eshkol Navo. And her name is Judith Gurevich, and she has all of her authors come to her home, and they read the novel aloud. And it's this process, it's like a David Grossman novel. I mean, it's this process of reading over days, and it's very intense. And there are those kinds of encounters that you're describing. It might interest you that, in the late 19th century, this was actually very common. I've worked on this, that people would they had nothing else to do. There was no internet. There was no Netflix. People would read aloud to each other for hours on end. It's not just parents reading to their children, but Theodor Herzl would do this. He would read aloud from the entire Der Judenstaat, the Jewish state. He would read it aloud to anyone who would listen for hours on end. And many of fin de siècle writers of that era, they did the same thing. So think about the power of orality and how that's essential for the creative process. So this is all very internal. And then I'm wondering, when you're writing, or maybe when you're not writing, or in between writing, obviously you read a great deal. And I guess all writers hate to be asked this question, but I need to ask, how do you think that other writing influences your own work, whether it's European literature or world literature from a different era or from our own era, and in particular the circle of Israeli novelists? I assume you all read each other's work and respond to it. To what extent does any of this matter to you when you go into the creative process yourself? The influences from outside of you.
I think I was deeply influenced by European literature, from Thomas Mann and Dostoevsky, and later and Virginia Woolf and Bruno Schulz, a writer that I really love and try to promote his name in any occasion. And I was influenced by the early stories of Amos Oz and A.B. Yehoshua, the great Israeli writers. Amos passed away 2 years ago. And also Yaakov Shabtai, very highly recommended, a very, very special writer who described the shattering of the maybe even of the Zionist dream. And I read a lot when I write. I'm afraid I'm less prone to be influenced now, and I say it sorrowfully because I liked the time when I was influenced, and that it rebaked me in a way, and showed me new approaches to write and to describe reality. I just paging in my mind, seeing whom I failed to mention. The early works of Heinrich Bell were influential on me, and I guess also of Günter Grass. It's a dialogue. It's a ongoing dialogue between writer and other writers. And of course, I can be jealous at someone who took a very good idea and spoiled it. I think this is horrible. Maybe jealousy is not the right word, but I think it's horrible that such a good idea was wasted. But mainly, if I think about it, even if in the first versions of every writing, I'm more prone to be influenced or inspired from the outside and think about what this person will think or the other. After a while, if the story is a true story, then what inspires and influences me is the magnetic field of the story itself, the inner constitution of the story, and the characters and the relationship. And I'm totally tuned into them. And this is, you said, it's a hard job to be a writer. It's exhausting, but it's so rewarding. Really so rewarding, to be able in our world that is such a thick world, and a world that is being formulated by the media mainly with such thickness, to do in such a world something precise, to tune yourself totally to something that is really throbbing and unique. And to be able to touch it and to know now I said something truthful. I didn't know it before. As I said, it might look like a verdict against myself. It might look like something horrible that I say about myself. In that sense, the story has betrayed me. But on the other hand, maybe the story has been more loyal to me than I was able to be.
This is, I think, the authenticity of your work. The truthfulness that readers come away from. I think that when they read your work, they well, they come to know themselves better. I think in any great novel, you come away from it. Any great novel is in some degree a mirror, and you see yourself. The reader sees themselves through it. But you've written, in addition to novels for adults that are complicated, and you've written so many other kinds of work. You've done children's literature, which I would assume doesn't have quite the same demands, very different demands, I would guess. And you've also written for adolescents. And I think that's in some ways the hardest kind of writing. So books like Someone to Run With or The Zigzag Kid, which are youth fiction, and the whole genre of youth fiction can be a bit of it can often be not so great. The youth fiction that gets written in North America for high school students, for example. And yet you've produced works of youth fiction that are actually quite wonderful. And I'm wondering how you make that switch. We've been talking about this very intense kind of work that you've done in your novels so far, but how do you make the switch into these very different genres?
Again, it's not a decision, it happens. If I tune myself to the inner world of an adolescent, I will write in his or her voice, in his or her melody. I like to write for adolescents because I think there is a very short window of opportunity before they become cynical. And cynicism is something I really despise. But in my books for children, for young adults, I wrote at this point where they still are not corrupt by cynicism. And they are still willing to listen and to be changed. And it is very rewarding. I just got a letter from a girl who is 11 years old, and she read the Zigzag Kid book. And excuse me for quoting her, but she said, sometimes I read a book and I feel that the book is clever and I'm stupid. Sometimes I read a book and I feel that I'm clever and the book is stupid. With the Zigzag, I felt that I'm clever and the book is clever. And I thought it's wonderful, wonderful thing to say. But even more rewarding is writing for children at the age of 3, 4, 5, 6. And I wrote something like 19 or 20, who counts, books for this age. Maybe because it's an age that is easy for me to connect with. Maybe because I had my children and we have our granddaughters, 2 granddaughters, and I keep reading and writing for them. And when I write for children, I always think of the scenario, the setting of the act of telling the story. Usually we tell the stories to our children when they go to sleep, when we put them to bed. This is the good night story. And I think it's such an important moment in the everyday life of a family, because it's the moments, the very few moments after all the hustle and bustle and all the negotiation between the community of the grown-ups and the community of the child. And usually the grown-ups want to see the child under the blanket and with the closed eyes and stop bothering them. And I think it's such a waste of opportunity, because if you are willing to read your child a story, not just stick the laptop at their lap and tell them go to see Peppa Pig or something like that, which is wonderful, by the way. But I want to have the presence of the parent with the child, the father or the mother, so the child can feel the intimacy and the warmth and the pulses of the father or the mother. And he feels or she feels protected. And they need to be protected because they are just a moment before sailing into the night. And the night is frightening, it's dangerous. Things lose their shape and look differently. The sleeve of a shirt can look like a trunk of an elephant. There are shadows on the wall, there are lights on the wall suddenly. The voices of the other members of the family, they come differently. The child has a very strange and bewildering opportunity to see life without him or without her. Suddenly he gets a glimpse of what was it before he came to this world, and maybe other frightening thoughts can come to the mind, and also the dreams are frightening. And I remember the moment when my granddaughter understood that her father cannot go into her dream and save her and rescue her for something. So if you read the story to your child and you allow yourself, you as the grown-up, you allow yourself also to be taken by the story, to be taken by the language, because the language is so important. The child should understand almost every word in the story, but not all the words. I remember myself, and I was read to by my father, that there were several words that were so exotic and undecodable, yet I felt them, and I remember they continued to blink in the darkness after my father put me to bed. And I felt that there is some mystery, some exotic mystery about them. And on the way, I also studied new words, but this was not the purpose of reading a story. And in the story for children, there can be a legitimacy for a certain kind of humor, of absurdity, of all kind of extremity, of acting against the order of the home, but against it in a protected way. So if the story is written well and read well, both parties, the father, the mother, and the child, can come to this bubble of the good night story, and they are both tourists in this place. I still remember myself as a child of 3 or 4 looking at my father, who was a very authoritative man, and suddenly I caught a glimpse of him as a child, because he read something funny and he laughed and he was not controlled by himself. So as you can understand, I deeply recommend reading stories to your children.
As now with 3 young grandchildren, I couldn't agree more. It is in some ways the most wonderful time of day. You know, one theme that's come through in our conversation has been how you don't make choices. I mean, things just kind of come to you, and you start to write or start to imagine. But you do wear another hat, and maybe this is also not a matter of choice. You write political journalism, so that's not fiction. It's something where you're not blending, as in your fiction, there's your own experience, but there's, you know, the world that you're creating. These seem like very different registers. I mean, the world of literature, broadly understood, and the world of political writing, you do both. And I'm wondering if this is also something that just comes to you, like, I'm just going to sit down and write something, or if you make a choice that there's been some crisis in Israel that you feel you need to address, and you're going to set aside your writing for a little while and take on, you know, some political writing. How do you make those choices, or do you make those choices about undertaking political writing?
Usually I write an article when I cannot take it anymore, when I feel I'm going to explode with the rage or other negative qualities. And it takes me a lot of time to write an article. I don't write it easily. And usually I cannot write it out of an invitation from the outside. As I said before, it must come from within. But I think I'm still a writer when I write my political essays and articles. I insist on nuances of words. I do not collaborate with words that are given to me by the government or by the army or by other journalists. I will try to bereft the person I write about from the stereotype. This is something that writing, and especially writing, political writing, taught me. You know, in the Talmud, there is a saying, there is no joy like undoing or untying doubts. You know, if you have a doubt and it torments you and you untie it, there is this relief and joy. And I say there is no joy like the untying of a stereotype. There is a stereotype of someone that we were programmed even to see in one way only, and suddenly we can look at him or at her from a different point of view. There is a flow of emotions and understanding and ideas. And you know, in our region, our tormented region, there are a lot of talks about the Israeli narrative and the Jewish narrative and the Palestinian narrative. And I feel a narrative is a human story that has congealed, that has frozen. And this is a great part of the journalism that I'm reading today. It's a congealed, frozen human story. And what I try to do when I write, not always succeed successfully, but I try, is to melt this general narrative and to bring the voice of the individual. I will always prefer to write about the individual who is trapped in this situation. This is also, by the way, something that I do in my writing. Every one of my books is about an individual who is facing an outer arbitrariness that has no crack in it, that you cannot penetrate through, that you cannot really communicate with. And I learned in my career as a writer and as an essayist that whenever I write about this monolithic wall of arbitrariness, I can change something in the situation, the relationship that I have with this arbitrariness, even when I write about death, the death of a precious person. Not that I will reverse the wheel of death and life, of course not. Not that I will stop the occupation if I write 100 articles about the occupation. But something will be changed. I will, as I said in the beginning of our talk, I will not be trapped by the situation. I will describe it in other ways, in other nuances, in other emphases. And by so doing, I will just show and practice the freedom that I still have in front of it. I'm not totally crushed by the situation. I can still portray how possible future might look like. And if I'm able to do it, if I'm not paralyzed by the situation, it means that still, I don't know for how long, I am not a victim of this situation. And believe me, Derek, for me as an Israeli, as a Jew, not to feel a victim of such an extreme situation is a very good beginning.
No, I completely appreciate this sense of empowerment. You're describing an agency and how writing can be an act of asserting control. What effect, well, you're a renowned writer and your position is secure. I'm just thinking about people who take those risks and who say what they think and who endure the consequences, and writers at risk. And to what extent you're part of a community of writers that is political, that has to deal with not just criticism, but sometimes the blowback can be quite severe. And the threats to the expression of personal opinions can be quite severe. And if you've dealt with either individually or in the community of writers.
I think every one of us who is writing against the government, against the occupation, he or she knows the implications of it and the brutality and the vulgarity that is addressed at everyone who dares to criticize Israel. Now, it's very clear. I'm an Israeli. I like to be in Israel. It's important for me to be here. It's the only place in the world that is relevant for me and meaningful. And I still, for years, I still insist that it can be changed, that Israel should become the home that it was meant to be. Unfortunately, until now, it's not only a home, it's also a fortress. And I would like to lower the part of the fortress and make it into a home, a place that we shall feel comfortable at, and a place that have solved the problems with our neighbors, a place that we are able to explore all layers of life, not only the layer of survival, not survival only. And yet we are not there. We are not there because we became used and even addicted to the situation of the occupation. And if you are occupying another people for 54 years very soon, next June, well, then your status as a democratic state is very shaky. It's very hard to call my country a democratic country while it continues to occupy another people, the Palestinians, for so many years without a real effort in the last years, especially under the regime of Netanyahu, to solve the situation, to change it, to bring it into a new discourse, and to free us from this distorted situation. It is a distorted situation. Derek, if someone came to you or to me in the day before the Six-Day War, in the 4th of June, 1967, and told us that in a week, Israel will become an empire, an occupier of another people, and it will last more than 5 decades. If someone told me like that, I think someone is crazy, because it's such a nightmare of so many Israelis. But at the same time, we got used to live in this situation. We found the advantages of it. we know how to function as occupiers, and we are so efficient and so talented about that we have no opponent on the other side. The Palestinians are totally broken and unable really even to try to wage peace with us, not trying to make some effort towards peace with us or to challenge us. And I think that unless they have their home, we shall not have our home. It's only both homes that can exist and coexist. If only one has a home, he will not have a home. In the end, this distorted reality will explode in our face. And for me, it is so essential to experience the feeling of having a home, because, you know, as a Jew, as an individual Jew, but also as part of the Jewish collective, I know we never felt at home in the world. Never, even in the most hospitable places, there was always the danger of being uprooted overnight sometimes and being dispersed or being genocide even. And Israel is meant to be the remedy, the curing of this distortion. Israel is meant to be the place where we shall feel at home, where we shall be rooted, where we shall be able to decode everything that happens, where we shall have our ceremonies and our language and the language Hebrew. And by the way, as part of being at home, being able to include in this home the Israeli Palestinians, the 20% of the Israelis who are not Jewish, they also should feel at home in our country, in their country. If this doesn't happen, we shall find ourselves again and again in situations of war. It will reassure to us that we are doomed to fight. We shall continue to vote for belligerent leaders again and again, and belligerent leaders, they doom their people to belligerent situations. We shall be trapped in having peace. And I talk to you as someone who never really experienced real deep, cultivated in the heart's peace. One day in my life, I didn't have something like that. Maybe because of that, I yearn so much for it. But having peace is such an existential change that we might experience. It's not only the question of, you know, solving the problems of the refugees and of the irrigation of the borders of the holy places. It's really moving to another way of being in this life, being in this world. Sorry for the long speech, Derek.
No, it's hugely important. I was just wondering, time for a final question or a follow-up, which is, there's many kinds of peace. There's the menucha nechona. I mean, there's the peace of death. There's the peace of a sleeping child who's been told a bedtime story and is happily sleeping while the parents look on. There's the peace that's a truce or a hafuga, a kind of a respite. There's the peace where war is unthinkable. And it sounds to me that you're talking about, obviously, the more long-lasting, enduring forms of peace, but how do you respond to your critics who would say, well, you're a novelist, you're a great artist, but what do you know of military affairs? Leave that to the generals, leave that to the security experts. You know, artists, I think there's this derogatory term in Hebrew, yafei nefesh, dovish, you know, I think in English we'd say bleeding hearts. How do you respond to the criticism that somehow the matters of war and peace are too important to be left to the artists and the poets?
I don't think that artists, writers, poets understand in reality or political situation more than carpenter, journalist, historian, or Knesset member. But they do understand something, and they have their sensitivities. And they can sharpen the sensitivity of the people who read them. And I think they deserve to be listened to, because we listened for too long time to generals, and look where they have brought us. And by the way, we just now made peace with some Arab countries, the Emirates and Morocco and south of Sudan, and this is very important. I think it's a very important and a decision that can really change reality. But we cannot overlook the Palestinians when we make this piece of the rich between us and the Emirates. The misery of the Palestinian society and its situation will become very, very relevant to us, even if we try to ignore her. So, as I said, I don't understand more than politicians, but I understand something about human beings, about what they can tolerate and what they cannot, about how oppression can distort the people, the occupier and the occupied. And I know also the pain of the cost of this situation of having no solution, and the really the painful experience of losing someone very precious. I'm talking about my son, Uri, who fell almost 15 years ago in the Second Lebanon War. Let's say it teaches me something about what should be prevented and about what we should not collaborate with, and what we should do everything we can in order to prevent other tragedies, other pains of other people, let them be Israelis or Palestinians.
Thank you. Thank you for sharing that with us, with the whole audience. And I know that we have 1 minute left, and so I'm going to hand it over to, I believe Shelley is waiting in the wings. So Shelley, it's all yours.
Thank you, David Grossman in Jerusalem and Derek Penslar in Toronto. David Grossman's latest books are A Horse Walks into a Bar and More Than I Love My Life, which will become available in English in August and is already available in French as La vie joue avec moi. Derek Penslar's latest book is Theodor Herzl, The Charismatic Leader. For these books in English, please go to paragraphbooks.com. For David Grossman's French titles, leslibraires.ca. Thank you all, audience, and David Grossman and Derek Penslar for joining us for this event that has been produced and presented by Blue Metropolis International Literary Festival. If you'd like to check out other festival events, please go to bluemetropolis.org/festival 2021 or metropolisbleu.org. C'est le genre de tiret de côté, Festival 2021. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you, Derek. Thank you very much.
It was a pleasure and an honor.
Let's compromise on pleasure.